Serious, those who came from war-torn areas and times, what's it like to live as a civilian in a war zone? I come from Bosnia. I was 12 years old when the war started in my country. I remember everyone being scared. I lived in a small town of 50,000 people. The war was raging everywhere around us. Our town hasn't been attacked yet. It could be any minute. You never know. You hear detonations and bombs exploding in the distance. For a 12-year-old, it was a strange feeling. One part of me was glad about it, because the school was closed and I didn't have to submit any assignments. No homework. The other part of me was scared. I remember one day playing video games on my Commodore 64 when suddenly low-flying enemies MiGs flew above our town. There were about 5-6 of them flying so low, our apartment started shaking. I never experienced this kind of noise before. I thought the world was collapsing. That was one of the scariest moments. I still remember it as it was yesterday. I remember going with my parents to familiarize ourselves with bomb shelters. In case they start bombing our town, we need to go to the shelter. We had to be prepared. Finally, my dad was able to take my mom, brother and myself to neighboring Croatia to a refuge camp. Few days later, our town was showered with bombs and rockets. I was fortunate to leave the town few days before. Some war-torn areas can be less war-torn than they appear. I grew up in Northern Ireland, and anyone who lived through the 1970s and 1980s will talk about how semblance of normality still went on. There were school dances, and music concerts, and football matches. There were dinner parties, and school plays, and everything else you'd associate with a normal society. That didn't change even though you had to pass army checkpoints if you drove anywhere, go through metal detectors when you were going into a shop, and witness terrorist attacks on the news every week. People just carried on. I live in Iraq, Baghdad to be more precise. It's not a war zone, I think it's more of a post-war zone. Okay, so I'm gonna try to give you an idea on what's going on here. There are so many things wrong in this country. First, you have security. You can never tell what's gonna happen next. A car bomb, an explosive pack thrown to the side of the road, or some fricked up butthole starts shooting people, or another fricked up butthole comes to kidnap you and tries to get ransom for your life or corpse. Second, you have corruption. For example, if you want to get a paperwork done, like getting a passport, you have to pay a bribe to the employee if you want to get it done, and if don't, you never know what's gonna happen to the form you submitted. And if you want to get a job in the government, you have to belong to the party that is currently controlling that part of the government, and if you don't give in and join their party, they'll just give the job to someone else who gave in and joined them. And don't get me started on the parliament, it's so corrupt that if you were to give them a month vacation it wouldn't matter anyway. Third, you got the educational system. It's so messed up I can't even tell when to put a comma or when to put a stop. I think the teachers just gave up on the kids and the good teachers are getting worse and worse. Fourth, you got the value of a human soul. Nowadays if we hear that a car bomb blew up somewhere, we ask how many dead, get a reply, then shake our heads and just move on. It's fricked up. But we've gotten used to it. I'm trying to describe what's happening, but I can't even begin to describe it enough. There's much to be done to get this country back on its feet. Oh, and if I made it like if there's no good people left, I am just speaking about the majority of the people. And sorry about my English. Your English was fine. Thanks for your post, dude. All the best. I was born and raised in Colombia. Basically, my entire life there was spent living in a war zone. First, in the 80s and early 90s, we had to deal with Pablo Escobar and the cartels blowing up a mall or an airplane every other day, and the brutal murder of politicians and presidential candidates was a normal occurrence. Then, after Pablo was killed in '94, the FARC and other insurgent groups took over the drug traffic, so now we were dealing with civilian kidnappings and ambushes in small towns. Living in a war zone when you don't know any different is bizarre. Every day, an airplane gets hijacked and its passengers are taken hostage, or some butthole decides to blow up the plane to send a message to the government that they won't be extradited to the US. There is military presence everywhere, so much that I used to think it was normal to see tanks just up and down the streets. When I was a teenager, my parents wouldn't let me go anywhere because they were afraid that I would get kidnapped or blown up. Still, I didn't find my life out of the ordinary. I went to school, had friends, had parties, etc. I remember my uncle was murdered by the insurgents on my best friend's 15th birthday, and I wasn't able to go to her party. I was peeved because I had been planning to attend for so long. One of my very best friend's dad was kidnapped and murdered when his family couldn't come up with the ransom money. My ex's father was murdered when he tried to run for president back in '89. Lots of people fled the country in those times, but my family had a good socio-economic position without being too public, so we stayed. Fortunately, the situation in Colombia has improved a lot, but I think growing up amongst such violence affects you in ways you can't really comprehend until you move to a country like the US, where people panic over the smallest of things. On 9/11, I remember being sort of numb to the pain everyone around me was feeling because how many terrorist attacks did I live through? It didn't dawn on me that those things just don't happen in America until much later. Anyway, if you have any specific questions you want to ask, I'll be happy to answer them. Other than that, this is the best that I can come up with to describe what I'm sure are traumatic events. Was about 5 years old when the war started affecting my town in Croatia. Basically, I remember when the Croatian army blew up the bridge connecting my town to Bosanski Brod. I woke up scared shitless because I never heard something so loud in my life. Few days after that, Serbian army started shelling my town with mortar and arties. I can talk about shitload of stories what happened. The MiGs, tanks, snipers, shelling from the other side of the river. After my dad joined the military, my mom made sure me and my brother were sent off to my aunt living in Zagreb because there was this general feeling our town will be attacked en masse soon, since it was one of the best locations for crossing the river. Coming back was a shock because seeing my building and the neighboring ones being half in rubble because of mortar fire. The place where I usually spend playing got bombed. After about 2 months I left the town. My mother was raised in Vietnam. She said that hearing bombs going off was normal. She would often see American aircrafts flying over her hometown, Hue, and dropping bombs. Vietnamese communists often implanted bombs into roads and farmland. She's seen many people killed, American soldiers, communists, and innocent civilians. A lot of people were trying to flee to Hong Kong, China to work in factories and warehouses in order to get a boat ride to go to America. On a lighter note, my mother said that her and many other children loved American soldiers. The children spoke very little English but would follow around American soldiers. She said the soldiers were really funny despite their language barrier and give them candy, ice cream, and soda. My mom used to wait outside American camps with tons of other kids, and American soldiers would throw candy and other goodies over the wired fence that bordered their camp. My boyfriend's father was raised in Vietnam as well. One of his jobs was to help carry dead bodies and dispose them in massive grave pits. He and my boyfriend's mother fled Vietnam and went to China as well. They learned fluent Cantonese and Mandarin there and eventually came to America. While living the expat life, I took up residence in Belfast during the Troubles. Strange days, seeing peace walls to separate themselves from their neighbors. I had to learn to be constantly on alert, always guarded, mindful of possibly wearing the wrong color on the wrong side of the street. I remember buying a pack of cigarettes at some wee shop while a gunfight was going on a few streets over, and thinking, not too close by, I should be able to get home in one piece. Stayed there about 8 months, got the business contacts I needed and took off back to Edinburgh. Glad to hear you came back to Scotland. Not too many gunfights happen on Princes Street. I came from Mostar, Bosnia. I was there during the entirety of the war. I was about 8 years old when the war started. My house was actually really close to the front lines. Like Vosdra 78 mentioned already, it was scary as a kid, but you make do. Like him, I didn't really have school for the most part during that time, so you try to make the best of it. I spent a fair bit of my time playing with my friends and destroyed buildings, etc. We used to collect shell casings, just because they were everywhere. When the shelling starts, you move inside and stay away from any open spaces, windows as much as you can. When it stops, you go back to trying to be a kid. Honestly, for me the scariest part was not knowing if my dad would come home, as he was in the military the whole time, gone months at a time sometimes. I did have one particular close call that stuck with me. During the shelling we would usually go under the stairwell in our house as it was considered the safest area. This day when it started we all went to hide, and something hit the wall directly opposite the doorway that leads under the stairwell. A piece of shrapnel hit the wall inside the doorway, about a foot above my head right as I was going inside. Needless to say, I was happy to be short for my age at the time. After the war, we got the opportunity to move to California through an immigration program. Thanks for sharing your story. Mostar is a beautiful place. Shame it was destroyed by Croats during the war, but it looks amazing now they have rebuilt the place. I think I might visit it one day. My grandpa lived in North Korea before the Korean War. During the beginning of the war he said that the adults in his village rounded up all the kids and told them to go to South because they knew about the dangers that the communist regime would bring. My grandpa left for the South with 5 of his friends, but eventually he was the only one who made it to the South. The others either died by the North Korean soldiers or starved to death on the way. It was heartbreaking to see my grandpa mourn for his friends and family. I took an oath to myself and my grandpa that if the chance presents itself, I would help liberate North Korea from the oppressive regime. About 10 years ago I lived down the street from this Russian guy named Zil. I was about 10 at the time and he and my dad got along well because they both had family from Ukraine. He was always willing to lend a hand if we needed it and seemed like a nice and friendly guy. One night he shows up at our door pretty drunk. Dad answered and Zil said, "Would you like a drink, my friend?" while holding out a bottle of vodka. My dad told me to go upstairs to bed, but I was curious and wanted to know what was going on. So I pretended to go to bed, but really I sat on the stairs and eavesdropped. They talked about work for a bit when Zil brings up that he had got a job offer from a wealthy Russian guy to move back to Russia and serve as his bodyguard. Then he started talking about his time serving in the Russian army during the occupation of Afghanistan. Zil had a friend who was like a brother. They had known each other almost their entire lives and got to serve in the same units during the war. Well, one day, after they had swept a village for insurgents and found nothing, Zil and his friend were talking and waiting to move out, when out of nowhere his friend is shot in the head by a sniper. Through tears, Zil said he lost it. He and his unit went from door to door through the village and killed everyone. When they were finished they burned the village to the ground. He took some time to compose himself a little and told my dad that the faces of those people he had killed would always haunt his nightmares. How he knew his friend wouldn't have wanted him to react that way and how he wished he never had anything to do with the Russian army. The last I heard, he had taken the job and was back in Russia. Frick man, that's insane. I can see how within just a few minutes of extreme rage you could kill many people just with the twitch of your finger on a trigger, hoping for relief, especially if your country is used to stories of killing. I was in Beirut in 2006, when it was getting pounded by the Israelis, taking refugees over to the UN camp in Cyprus. I was in the RN, and I remember everyone we took on board just being totally exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally, the works. Never realized before then how lucky I was to have grown up in a stable country. I'm from Croatia. I was about 5 when the war broke out and 6 when the Serbian army came to the village me and my family lived in. I remember my dad told us all to hide in the basement until he told us otherwise. I can clearly remember the sound of the tanks and trucks drive past our house and the ground shaking. We hid for 4 days until the bombs started dropping and my mom freaked out, pulling me and my brother with her to our cousin's house 20 miles away where we were sheltered 3 days until the Serbs reached that town as well. We hadn't heard from my dad in over a week at this point and my mom had given up hope finding him alive if ever seeing him again. We were captured. Some of us tortured. Monsters are saints compared to what I witnessed for 2 days. My mom's sister was raped and murdered and her husband shot in front of everybody. They split men and women into groups and shot the men if their wife fought back their attempt of rape. The thing I remember best is when 3 soldiers took my youngest cousin and whipped her with barbed wire and cut her head off and kicking to it like it was a football. A couple days later a small group of un-Croatian soldiers came to the town and freed us and they were followed by some reporters. My brother later told me my mother asked if they had seen my dad and she went through their pictures like a maniac till she found a picture of him hung from a lamppost with a sign Bezvrejedno Staka. Me and my brother now live in Denmark and have been in more foster cares than I can count. I haven't seen my mother in 17 years, only received letters once or twice every 3 years from my uncle who takes care of her and the rest of my father's family. We were 29 family members in the village when the war started. We were 11 left when the Croatian army came and saved us. As a fellow Croat, this makes me very sad. I am sorry for the loss of your father. I was lucky enough to be living in America during the war. I hope you're doing well. Ostity Jack. Just an hour ago my grandma told me a story when Lithuania was occupied by SSRS during World War II. She was very young then and lived in a small village in Lithuania with her family of 14. She remembers that everyone was terrified of bombs that were dropped from the sky without warning on people's houses. So her and 2 other families of 6 decided to build a bunker. Few men worked day and night to dig a huge hole, then reinforced the walls with huge logs and covered the top with 5 layers of fir logs. Then they covered everything with dirt. They were hoping that the bunker would save them even from a bomb dropped directly on it. The entrance was from the side and when you enter the bunker was L-shaped so that they would be away from the entrance in case something happened. The bunker was around 40 square meters and only had a few benches and a small table inside. The 3 families, 26 people, lived there for a week until they heard the arriving tanks. I'm not sure how, but she said they just had to move out of the village. Greek v Turk War in Cyprus. When I was 4 or 5 there was a civil war. My sisters had been packed off to a convent in the capital for safety much earlier. For some reason I stayed in the house with my mother and father. The house was all shuttered up and dark inside. I didn't understand why. There were odd popping sounds in the distance. I didn't know what they were. My dad said the poor Greeks were shooting their landlords. Whenever a pop sounded my dad would say, "There goes another landlord." My mother didn't like this and there were sharp words. He stopped. They never rode and this was the first time there was clear tension between them. The popping came closer and closer. They discussed leaving. My dad decided no, they would not come up to this place. It was dark but he wouldn't put on a light. I asked him to go out and make them stop. He told me he'd do it in the morning. He'd get on the horse and ride out and tell them all to pack it in. It was too dark to do it now for the horse might put its foot in a rabbit hole and fall. The sound came up the valley of popping and crashing. I smelled smoke but was not allowed to look out the window. I was put to bed in the cellar. My mum and dad were with me. They lit a candle. She knitted and he sometime went out to check things. Later, a day, I went to the village at the bottom of the valley with my dad. He held my hand really tight. It was deserted. Sandbags and widows. Cars across the roads and more sandbags. Shrapnel marks on walls and around some windows in particular. It was strange seeing the busy village empty. We looked at the cafe we often ate in. It was on the corner and the widows all smashed. Table upturned, there was a big brown patch on the floor. When my sisters returned they took me to a cemetery to look at the soldiers' graves. I thought I would get a gun to play with there. I thought they used guns to mark graves but it was just mounds of earth, loads of them. They hid from me and left me in the cemetery. I cried and they revealed themselves and took me home. That night I had nightmares. I told my dad what happened and they got punished. Hi there, I'm a second generation Palestinian refugee. I have lived the majority of my life in Lebanon, Jordan, and Yemen. I can't remember a time in my childhood when war wasn't nearby or conflict imminent. My earliest memory of actual violence directly around me was Israeli Air Force strikes targeting Lebanese civilian infrastructure, mainly electrical companies. I believe that was between 1999 to 2000. As it happened, we lived near the electrical company, and some neighboring buildings got demolished. 2 things I will never forget. One is that this was the first time I felt an intense dislike towards a certain group of people, the fear they instilled in me and the fact that I could not, for the life of me, understand why this was happening. I am lucky to have very liberal, open-minded parents that never tried to indoctrinate me with anything, especially politics. In fact, they tried to shelter me from it, but alas, it is the Middle East. Luckily my family and I got to a bomb shelter where we spent the night. The next day we left for another town nearby, And second thing I will never forget is the absolute silence of the entire neighborhood the day after, usually bustling with activity and sounds. The next morning you can only hear some distant sounds of family members salvaging their dead from under the debris. Even the birds and insects flee the area. That's how quiet it was. That silence will forever haunt me. Funnily enough, I never thought those were unique experiences till I moved to California in 2010. I didn't exactly live in a war zone, but I dealt with a pretty unique experience. I grew up in the Dubai, not the same futuristic Dubai it is today, more of a regular small city in the Middle East. During the Gulf War, UAE was harboring American troops, giving them a base of operations close to the war zone. This pissed Saddam off, and he threatened to drop a nerve gas bomb on this tiny country no larger than the state of New Jersey. Everyone starts freaking out. People are selling gas masks for $10,000, clearing store shelves of non-perishable food items, parking their cars on high ground, getting to the roof of buildings and setting up camps for their families, etc. It was madness for about a month or so, then the war ended. I saw people fighting for bottles of water, bags of rice, gasoline, batteries, etc. The whole place was like a free-for-all zone. It was pretty terrifying as a kid. I'm from Sri Lanka. Civil war between the Tamil terrorist separatists LTTE and government forces lasted for over 2 decades. Thousands of casualties all across the island. Suicide bombings in major cities. Government offices to major events. Bomb scares and threats all around. And bombs going off in buses or even roadside bombings as well, killing scores of people everywhere. It was a dark period really. I was born into it as well, but finally saw the war end in 2009. The worry that your loved ones or you could be blown up at any minute was the constant worry tugging at the back of your mind. People living the war zones actually lost almost all their loved ones and their possessions as well. And the fortunate ones got to emigrate, but the less fortunate had to suffer under the terrorists or get caught between the crossfire. It was absolute madness. Throwaway. My mother born in France and was 16 when the Nazis marched into Paris. She lived her teenage years under the Nazi occupation. She and her mother had a safe house for downed airmen in Paris and did small jobs for the resistance. She saw friends shot and killed by the Nazis. She was part of a rescue group that would enter bomb buildings to look for survivors and bodies after air raids. She also went to school and became a nurse. She turned 21 when the Allies liberated Paris. After the liberation, she worked triage for the trains returning from the concentration camps. She died last year at 90. To the very end, she had PTSD and nightmares from the war. It never left her. When 9/11 happened, she became so anxious that we had to hospitalize her for a week. As I grew up, she told me many of the stories of what she went through. She wrote a memoir for her grandchildren so they would know and understand. However, there were things that she could never talk about and horrors buried deep in her soul. I feel I should end on a positive. For many years my mother had a strong dislike for anything German. The scars were just too deep. Towards the end of her life, she met a German woman who was the same age. They talked and found that they had shared experiences from both growing up as civilians during the war. At the end, it didn't matter that Michelin was French or that Anna Marie was German. They both suffered and starved. They both saw death and carnage. I would like to think that they both helped each other heal, if only just a little. My mom was born in 1937 in Clofton, Norway. Her parents had a small farm. She told me that the Nazi took everything that was produced on all farms. My grandmother hid food for her children while not feeding herself. Mengele is the devil to my mom. I live in Northern Ireland and grew up here during the later half of the Troubles. I was fortunate enough to miss the peak of the fighting in the 70s, but it was still pretty hairy in the 80s and 90s. I was never injured from any of the violence aside from a few fist fights and beatings. There's a few areas in my city where I would have been attacked, but it's easy enough to avoid them. The majority of males who grew up here will have taken a few beatings in their life due to political hatred, but it's no big deal compared to what others went through. After the Good Friday Agreement, when the Troubles effectively ended, the paramilitaries had a ceasefire and stopped murdering people. To punish them instead, they would shoot people in the kneecaps. I had a friend who was kneecapped and he hasn't been able to walk properly since. I also had a few friends who were told to leave the country or leave their area. The bombings mostly stopped after the GFA as well. The only bombings I ever witnessed was hearing a few car bombs go off near my home as a child. I was once visiting a friend's house in a dodgy area of the city and a bomb went off down the street. I was nearly deafened by it. The windows smashed in every house on the street right up to my friend's house. It was on top of a hill, so the shockwave from the explosion must have went right over the house. I was involved in one riot where two groups each of about 1,000 people were throwing pint glasses and rocks at each other. I was lucky not to be injured and the riot was broken up within minutes. I was also trapped in a friend's house once as a riot was going on outside for several hours. These are rare violent occurrences. Most of the inconvenience comes from occasional road closures due to bomb threats or riots. Friends of mine have also been evacuated from their homes in the middle of the night due to bomb threats. As I said at the beginning, I missed the worst part of the violence and don't want to give people the wrong idea about what Northern Ireland is like nowadays. The murder rate from the Troubles is 3 per year compared to over 200 per year at the peak of the violence. My parents come from different religious backgrounds, which was somewhat rare at the time, but now both sides of our community are much more united. Most people have moved on from the violence and those who are still trying to proliferate it are rightly looked down upon by the majority of society. Now we have all the things that other developed countries have and the same standard of living apart from an occasional inconvenience. I could easily leave if I wanted to, but I actually like it here and would encourage others to come and visit if you get the chance. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.